begin though by thanking Ruhi. I know she's worked tirelessly to make today possible. I've witnessed how hard she has worked, so thank you so much, Ruhi, for making it possible. We're talking about political violence and how it impacts on women. I'm looking at political violence from a different point of view to what maybe is described as opposition. I'm looking at state-sponsored political violence against women and how that manifests itself in laws. Basically, what I've seen in the last few years from going about my daily business, I attend a lot of international meetings at the UN, the EU, and a lot of other places. And constantly what I hear at non-Iranian gatherings, doesn't matter, as a human rights defender, I sit in on sessions on Egypt, on Burma, on China. What we hear is, you could change the name of the country, the kind of oppression, the kind of pressure, the kind of violence that you see remains the same. And the kind of reaction to that violence, to that oppression is also the same. There's only so many ways that they can oppress us, and there's only so many ways that we can stand up to it. So it doesn't matter who is the oppressor, which country. The point is that political violence, when it finds its way into laws, when it finds a way of actually legally discriminating against women, as it has done in Iran, for me it takes on a very frightening dimension. So it's not just a question of domestic violence, which is terrible, or political violence in the sense of opposition or getting armed, or terrorist activity, as sometimes political violence can be described. But when a state decides to discriminate against a group of people based on its own ideology. And the Islamic Republic is no different to all the other countries. I see that it has a religious identity, and that religious identity has interpreted itself into laws. And when you look at the laws in Iran, it actually legally that means women and religious minorities are very clearly discriminated against. So I'm going to look at different aspects of this. The question of national identity, Iranian national identity, has become very strong in the face of this Islamic identity, and with this Islamic identity that legally is trying to be enforced, and culture change and all these sort of things that is trying to happen in Iran. We've got a resurgence of nationalism, Iranian national identity, but at the same time, it's also given a voice to women groups' identities, lesbian, gay, that identity, and also ethnic nationality identities. So the more they're trying to enforce this kind of identity politics, of a state-enforced identity on the people, we're seeing that little, smaller groups of identity are being formed and coming forward. But then the Islamic Republic says, my laws are the word of God. It's there, as we were talking this morning about whose culture, whereas in Iran it's a question of whose Islam. It's a small interpretation, it's a small group, and their interpretation of Islam, which is governing in Iran. It doesn't mean the Sharia that's governed in Iran is necessarily the Sharia that's governing in Iraq or in Egypt or any the other Muslim countries in the world. We see that after 34 years, we still have revolutionary courts in Iran. And when people are dragged in front of this revolutionary court, it's not about necessarily political dissidents. It's looking at the cultural and the ideological revolution that they tried to make happen 34 years ago, and people are still resisting. And when you're seeing young people in the street gathering signature, fighting for equal rights, that then threatens the national security. And this national security, in my opinion, is nothing more than the religious identity that the regime is trying to use to enforce its own power and to remain in power. So it's using this religious identity as a tool to keep itself in power. And that's the same in all the other countries that I've seen. But in Iran, if we look at the plight of women and how this then manifests itself in laws, behind there, by the coats, there's a little banner This is actually part of a much larger banner. And it's an effort by the Iranian women activists against the family protection bill that was introduced into Parliament 4 years ago. With it, giving men certain rights according to their interpretation of Sharia. So again, it's the men's interpretation of Sharia, which allowed men to take up other wives without the knowledge or permission of the first wife. Where we were before this introduction of the new bill, man could take up another wife, but the first wife had to give permission and she had to be aware. So not only have they gone backwards, they're now trying to go even further back by saying necessarily the woman doesn't even need to know. As long as the man goes to court and says to the judge, I can financially support 2 households and I promise I'll be a just husband, then the court will give him permission. Now the women's rights activists stood up to this and they fought very hard, and this particular article has been changed and unchanged and changed, and it's gone back and forth from various committees in the Parliament. One of the major things that they did, despite the fact that the women's rights movement was oppressed after the 2009 elections and the fact that we had a lot of people in prison or a lot of people left, the women who stayed in Iran have very cleverly adapted the way that they're standing up to change. They can't come into the streets anymore because obviously their lives are in danger. So what they've done very quietly, they're researching, they've set up websites to show how they can oppose laws through finding loopholes. Like with marriage contract laws, they're finding loopholes of how they can give certain rights back to women who lose those rights as soon as they get married. So for me, violence is taking away a right. When a woman needs a husband's permission to go to work, when a woman needs a husband's permission to go out of the house to meet with her family, this is all violent. This is violence. It's violence sanctioned by law. So they've stood up to it, and they've gone around the 4 corners of Iran. They managed to gather in this very tight, oppressive state that we had just after the 2009 elections. They gathered 15,000 signatures, which was unbelievable because these are normal women who are not necessarily educated. Again, we were talking this morning about the elite wanting to bring about change. These are very ordinary members of the public, who some of them couldn't read and write, but they've had their children write. And they wrote letters to members of the Parliament, don't ratify this bill. And the girls made a banner of these letters, which is the plight of these women, telling their stories of how a husband who has more than one wife has affected their lives, the lives of their children, and the lives of the children of this second wife, third wife, fourth wife. And all the other articles in this family protection bill that was introduced. So I'm using this as an example. We managed to get the banner out of Iran, and we've gone around the world with it basically. It's gone to the CSW last year, it's gone to the Human Rights Council, it's gone to several places, Amnesty Internationals internationally, it's gone all around the world. And what we're doing is saying, look, these are ordinary women who are standing up to violence in law. They're demanding their rights, very simply saying, this is my right, I'm not having it violated anymore. And if you, sadly, you can't read Persian, and we've translated some of the letters into English. That's only a portion of it. Some of them have drawn images of how they feel. They feel that they're hung. They feel themselves suffocated in the kind of lives that they have. So basically, the kind of political violence that I'm talking about, and I'll stop here because I don't want to take too much of the time, it's state-sponsored violence against a group of its own population, half of Iran's population, under the name of the word of God. They're using the Islamic interpretation that they have to legitimize the kind of violence in law that we see. And one last point that we talked about again this morning, this law against culture. It isn't enough that we have discriminatory laws in Iran that we're trying to change. The last few months of Khatami presidency, a document was produced under President Khatami. He didn't have time to ratify it because it was the last 3 months of his time. It's entitled The Propagation of Chastity and Hijab Culture. And the first thing that Ahmadinejad did as a president within 3 months of coming into office, he made it law. It became a directive that went to 27 ministries, organizations, government agencies, the military, the disciplinary forces, the police, in how to teach Iranian women to change culture, engineering, cultural engineering, social engineering, changing culture, to say that women who don't observe the hijab are bad, they're prostitutes, they're not to be trusted. How? By telling the television, if you're producing films and documentaries, you are to put bad women in loose hijab with Western appearances. These are the bad women. The good women are going to be the ones who are very Islamically covered, sitting at their prayer mat and being the martyr, being the mother, being at home, within the family. And they're trying to say that this is the image they want the television. Payan was talking this morning about using mass media. Islamic Republic is doing exactly that. It's trying to change public opinion, public culture, through films and productions that it's making. It's told the disciplinary forces, the police, to arrest women. Millions of Iranian women have criminal records because they've been arrested off the street because their hijab was back or their ankles was showing. This is violence in law, violence sanctioned by law. They're trying to change culture. Economically, they told the customs to allow tax-free black cloth that is used for the veil. So they're trying to encourage this. We have numerous fashion shows in Iran of women who are very beautifully Islamically dressed. So, and they're encouraging young girls at school, they're going into schools. So 27 ministries have been told this is, in every aspect of their work, they have to observe this. This is where we have the idea of segregation within hospitals, to have men and women treated by women and men. Obviously, women's health is going to be impacted upon because we don't have enough physicians. And that never happened. But this is the sort of thing, it's a direct result of this. So it's not enough that we have discriminatory laws. They're now trying to culture change and to say chastity and hijab is the most important attribute a woman can have. And for me, this is violence in law, and this is how I'm seeing this political will of the Islamic Republic translated into law to bring violence into the law every second of a woman's life in Iran. Very much.